I'm curious. I am curious. Curious.
By nature.
Welcome to Curious by Nature. I'm Jessica Johnson at Newswise. Artificial sweeteners and diet drinks have become part of daily life, but do we really understand their impact? While marketed as healthier alternatives to sugar, ongoing research raises questions about their effects on metabolism, long-term health, and even taste preferences. Could they be shaping our diets in ways we don't realize? Today, we'll explore this topic with a guest from George Washington University who studies the effects of sugar substitutes. Dr. Sylvetsky, thank you for joining us. Please introduce yourself.
So I'm Allison Sylvetsky, and my title is Associate Professor and Vice Chair in the Department of Exercise and Nutrition Sciences at the George Washington University Milken Institute School of Public Health. I'm curious about how early life exposures affect our later taste preferences and diet and ultimately shape the risk of chronic disease.
Could you tell me about your research overall and what you work on in your position at GW?
Sure. So in my role at QW, I wear a lot of hats. One is, teaching at QW. I teach a lot of different nutrition courses. I also have a lot of administrative work as the vice chair of the department. But my research has really been an exciting aspect of my job for a long time because it focuses both on consumption and perceptions of beverages, specifically sweetened beverages, and also studies to understand from different perspectives both how they're used and also how they affect our metabolism and health.
What are the sugar substitutes or the sweeteners that you are studying or that you found to have maybe adverse effects on health?
So we study a group of sweeteners that we refer to as non-sugar sweeteners, though there are a lot of terms for them. So people might be more familiar with artificial sweeteners or low-calorie sweeteners, non-nutritive sweeteners. And there are many different sweeteners that fall into this umbrella category, including aspartame, commonly found as equal, saccharin, commonly found as sweet and low, sucralose, commonly found as Splenda, stevia, which is found as Truvia, and other sweeteners as well. And what they all have in common is that they're sweet but contain no or few calories, and so they're widely used as replacements for added sugar. And our group is interested in all of them, though of course they are different compounds, and so while we often study them together, they also may have different effects.
Would you like to share a specific research study that you worked on maybe recently that you think is maybe representative of your work?
One of the studies that we're working on that I'm really excited about right now is a study that we call Sweet Pea, which stands for Sweeteners in Pregnancy. And the purpose of the study is to understand how exposure to various non-sugar sweeteners such as aspartame, sucralose, stevia, saccharin, things like that, how maternal consumption during pregnancy may affect the mother's health and the baby's health after birth. So this is a study that's ongoing, actually. It's a new study that we're collecting the data for right now. And so the design of the study is that women who already consume beverages with non-sugar sweeteners are randomized to either continue during pregnancy and lactation or to avoid non-sugar sweeteners and instead have unsweetened alternatives, either during pregnancy and lactation or only during lactation. And so we're recruiting women early in pregnancy, following them over time, and then trying to look at various outcomes both during pregnancy and postpartum.
Based on your previous research and what you've studied and what you've seen in terms of non-sugar sweeteners, what have you seen in terms of how they've affected people's health?
When you look at studies that follow large samples of people over time, which we refer to as observational studies, but they're not randomized controlled trials, consistently in those types of studies, we see that consumption of non-sugar sweeteners is generally associated with increased risk of diabetes, increased risk of obesity, increased risk of cardiovascular disease and other, adverse health outcomes. But those studies are not designed to determine whether it's a causal relationship. And we don't know if non-sugar sweeteners cause those outcomes or if we're just seeing that due to the way that, the study isn't having an intervention. It's just following people over time. So we can't say that that's due to non-sugar sweeteners specifically. And then there's other studies, randomized controlled trials, where they're more controlled and people are asked to, replace sugar with non-sugar sweeteners or compare non-sugar sweeteners to consuming water or something like that or unsweetened products. And the data there show that when it comes to weight, that using non-sugar sweeteners as a replacement for sugar may actually have some modest benefits in terms of helping people to eat a little bit less in terms of calorie intake or have modest benefits in terms of weight loss. But the big question that we're really interested in is how are these consumed in real life? And so, kind of trying to understand those discrepancies and also that a lot of the randomized control trials, because they're typically fairly short term, they can't, look at development of cardiovascular disease, over the time frame that people are enrolled.
Right. And also, it seems like maybe you're also looking at how that intake will affect children, like that developmental, even pre birth. Right.
Yeah, so it's a kind of an untapped area. There's been some rodent data and observational data that show that exposure may be associated with unfavorable health effects in the child. For example, there are data, again, observational studies that can't show causality, but that when they compared in this was a study done in Canada, but they looked at what the mothers consumed in terms of their beverage consumption during pregnancy and then the child's weight within the first year of life. And what they showed is that the children who were born to mothers who consumed diet beverages or beverages with these sweeteners actually had a higher risk of being overweight at 1 year old. And so that's intriguing. But again, we don't know whether that's causality or not. And that's really what we're trying to get at is how does this exposure directly affect the baby's weight and health?
Are the artificial ones different than the natural ones, like the stevios? Is stevia, is that natural?
Yeah, so stevia and monk fruit are both the plant-based ones that, are naturally derived as opposed to synthetic. But that's a really interesting question because we don't fully understand the mechanisms of how these work in the body. And so if the mechanism has to do with sweetness, then we would expect that no matter what, right, these are all sweet, they may have similar effects. But then we also know they're different compounds and therefore they may have different effects. And so that's one of the really important areas I think of future research in the field is trying to do a better job disentangling whether we're talking about all sweeteners or one sweetener because while they're category, they're all different.
How did you decide to go into this field?
Yeah, thinking back, I wasn't really sure what exactly I wanted to study. I knew I wanted to do something related to nutrition and obesity and diet related disease. And it really started when I was a doctoral student at Emory. I was working with a mentor doing a research rotation. And so one of the main conditions that she treats is non alcoholic fatty liver disease. These are children who have fat that's accumulating on their liver, and that can cause all sorts of metabolic problems. And one of the behaviors that's associated with this condition is high consumption of sugar sweetened beverages. And so in the clinical setting, a big question was, these children are being told to stop drinking sugary drinks and instead have diet beverages. But is that actually a good idea in terms of their metabolic health? And that's really how I got interested initially in this area.
And do you drink or use artificial sweeteners or non-sugar sweeteners?
I don't, I actually will admit before I got into this field, I did. um, I was a pretty, I would always put some in my coffee, but then once I really started studying this and thinking about, there are alternatives, right? And so my personal alternative is just I have over time come to like coffee without sweetener. And I know, some people have obviously different preferences and that may not be achievable or, doable for some people. It might not be acceptable to some people, but for me, just a little bit of milk does the trick. And so I really don't purposefully use them. That said, non-sugar sweeteners are all over the food supply and I don't, also necessarily go out of my way to avoid them either.
There aren't really, even if you go to a convenience store and you want to pick up something to drink, it's really water or sparkling water or maybe a tea that's unsweetened. But there aren't really many options for people to have beverages without maybe non sweeteners or highly unsweetened.
Certainly, I think there's more sweetened beverages out there in terms of variety, right? I mean, when you just think about walking into a grocery store and looking at the beverage aisle, but there are more and more products these days that are, water that have a little bit of flavor added or, sparkling waters with a little bit of juice in them. And so that is also an option, right? Is to have basically something that's a little bit sweet that is, a splash of fruit juice, which can even be made at home with, some sparkling water and a splash of fruit juice or a squeeze of lemon or lime or orange or something like that. So there are ways to make water palatable. And it does seem like, in the recent years that there has been some more products coming out that are intended to be kind of healthy alternatives.
What would you say are some of the fascinating things happening in your field right now?
There are a lot of things happening in the field that are fascinating. Just in terms of the things that are most closely related to some of the work we do, I think trying to understand in what ways different non sugar sweeteners may have similar effects or lack of effects, and also in what ways they are different compounds and therefore should be treated differently is really interesting. And that also has implications from, a regulatory and policy standpoint as well. And so I think that's one of the most fascinating things because also, as a consumer and as a researcher, these formulations in different products are, they're changing, right? And so some products maybe were once sweetened with aspartame and now have a different combination of sweeteners. And obviously, food products are complex. And so trying to tease apart the different sweeteners and also the combinations of sweeteners and also other ingredients in these products is pretty interesting.
Is there something that you would ideally like to be able to study?
Yeah, I think going back to what I mentioned at the beginning around the new study that we recently started looking at early life exposure is an area that's really fascinating. There's been a lot of work on developmental origins of health and disease. So knowing that, some of these exposures actually start very early in life and trying to understand over the life course how that may impact the risk of developing obesity and diet related chronic disease. And so that's an area that we're really interested in is trying to understand, exposure in utero, exposure postnatally, exposure early in childhood, and then throughout the life course, how that may or may not have, beneficial or adverse effects on people's dietary patterns. Their taste preferences is another really interesting area that requires more study, and then ultimately, their overall health.
Can you tell me about other studies that you worked on in the past that you think would be interesting for people to hear about?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of work on this topic over the last over a decade, really. And it's been interesting, again, to see the field evolve and also, as a consequence, right, our research questions evolve. And some of what we started working on, 10, 15 years ago, and this was during my doctoral and postdoctoral work at the NIH under the mentorship of Christina Rother, was trying to understand acute metabolic effects of these various non sugar sweeteners. And so trying to understand when you give a beverage that has a sweetener in it, for example, sucralose or asulfate potassium, and then you give a sugary drink, how does that affect glucose and insulin and other metabolic markers? And so that was how we started looking at this. And then now we're really interested in what about the chronic exposure? What about repeated exposure over weeks or months or years? And so that's been exciting to try to take something in a relatively short term, controlled, acute, not really reflective of real life sense, and then try to extrapolate that to real life consumption. And on a related note, thinking about real life, right, we're trying to understand how these are used. And one of the ways that we've been looking at this is to look at their role in overall diet quality. And so we wanted to understand how do people that consume these, what else are they eating, right? And what we observed is that actually diet quality was lower or worse in people that consumed more non-sugar sweeteners. And that's something that we can't say is, one causing the other, or sweeteners, non-sugar sweeteners causing poor diet quality. We can't say that. But it again really gets at the need to understand how these are being used, and whether, people who use them are doing other things that might help their health or vice versa.
Do you have any hypotheses about why people's quality of diet is lower when they're consuming more of the non-sugar sweeteners?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there are many potential explanations. One is that, of course, non sugar sweeteners are found in products that are typically packaged, typically have, other ingredients in them, right? So, kind of the growing area of ultra processed foods, that's where you're finding these non sugar sweeteners. You're not finding them when you go to get an apple right from the produce section. And so people who are consuming them through ultra processed foods may already be consuming a lot of added sugar, saturated fat, sodium, things like that, that we know are nutrients of public health concern. So that's one potential explanation. But there's also growing amount of evidence that shows that consuming these sweeteners may actually lead to, for example, increases in appetite or changes in taste preferences, right? And a lot of that's come from rodent literature. And we're trying to understand, does this actually relate to the context of human consumption? But there's a lot of mechanisms that have been proposed for biologically how this might be contributing. And that's another area that we're really trying to study.
What are the main sources of non-sugar sweeteners? I mean, I assume it's beverages, but then, like you said, it's many processed foods, I guess. What are some others?
Yeah, so the main source of non-sugar sweeteners is beverages. For example, diet soda, light fruit drinks, zero sports drinks, all those different products. But there are obviously also packets where people are adding them, in a packet of Splenda or Equal or something like that. But then more and more, especially with more public health emphasis being placed on reducing added sugars, we're seeing them in places where people often don't expect. For example, in oatmeals that are labeled, low sugar, or oatmeals that are labeled high fiber, right? Also, products that aren't really thought of as sweet, like English muffins or bread or kettle corn popcorn, right? So it's not like there's only one product category. It's not just diet beverages in packets or sugar-free candy, but actually even in some products where people don't expect them, more and more so, non-sugar sweeteners are being used, and often in combination with added sugar.
Yeah, I think that's something people maybe aren't very aware of with the whole big list of ingredients, right?
Yeah, it's hard for consumers to, especially time in the grocery store. And we've actually done some work talking to parents about, how they make different choices and, what is helpful, what is not helpful. And one of the things we hear a lot is, they don't have time to go through every single ingredient in the ingredients list, let alone understand what some of these ingredients even are.
How many different chemical names in the ingredients are there for the non-sugar sweeteners?
I don't know the number off the top of my head, but there are a lot. And even just the terminology that we use to describe them as a group is confusing when, some people are referring to them as different things. And so, I think non-sugar sweeteners is accurate. um, but there's also, other terms that are often suggested as well. So even, I mean, there's just a lot of confusion when it comes to consumers, but even in the scientific community, there's not really consensus on what these should be called as a category.
Thank you so much.
Curious by Nature is a production of Newswise. More than 7,000 journalists get the Newswise wires. Visit newswise.com and find out how to spread your news today.